All right, now, if you need, would somebody help me pass these out? All right, so the Chinese translation, we've got those ready for you tonight. They are printed tonight, thankfully. 7-Eleven was my friend today. We're in Exodus chapter 17. Exodus chapter 17, just 7 verses tonight, a little bit shorter passage tonight. What does salvation mean? That's what we're talking about. What is salvation? It's not just getting rescued from being thrown over the side of a ship. It's being liberated from slavery. It's being brought out. God sees that there's some things that are trying to kill us. There's some things that are trying to enslave us, and God actually comes down to rescue us, to bring us out. And we learned last week, or in the last couple of weeks, that in one aspect, salvation is a decisive process. There's a moment where you're brought out, where you're saved. On the other hand, salvation is a lifelong process where God works over time. You can be saved in an instant from slavery, but then over time, God has to work to get the slavery out of you. Okay, we talked about that extensively. So now we're into a section of the scripture where that's what we're dealing with. That's the Christian life. Okay, so now what we're talking about is how do we work out our salvation? How do we work out what does it mean to be a Christian? That's the real challenging part of the Christian faith, I think. You can be saved like that. And if you're saved tonight, that's what happened to you. You were saved. If I were to ask you the question, are you saved? And you responded to me, well, I don't know, I'm working on it. Can I just be honest with you? You're not saved. Okay, we need to talk after the service. You and I need to have a conversation and talk and figure that out. Okay? I want to help you understand how you can be saved. But on the other hand, once you are saved, then there's this lifelong process where God works in you to make you into God's image bearer. So how does he do that? And last week we started looking at, he often takes us into the wilderness. It's often through the rough places in life where God refines us and makes us into something beautiful. You know, some of you ladies have diamonds on your hand or on a necklace or on an earring. Some of you don't. I'm sorry. Maybe one day. But that diamond didn't come out of the ground looking like that. Okay? Did it turn off? Oh, you need to come out. Okay, move it back. We're making a video. Okay, it's not because I'm vain. Okay, it's because we have friends who are in mainland China that we want to keep up with what we're studying, and so that's what we do with this video. Okay, and so I can watch it during the week. Okay, I'm just playing. So that diamond doesn't come out of the ground beautifully refined and just ready to put on a ring. It has to go through a process. It has to be cut. It has to be polished. It has to be shaped by a master diamond cutter. Dear friend, you are a diamond in the rough. And God is shaping you, preparing you. And sometimes that process is actually quite difficult. Sometimes it's quite painful as God cuts away things in our lives. Okay, let's read the passage. Exodus chapter 17, the first 7 verses. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin. It's interesting that's the name of the wilderness, by the way. The wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord. You know, God is really smart. Okay, this is where I get myself in trouble. I start commenting on the scriptures and reading it. But God is really smart. You got 2 or 3 million people. Everybody can't just pack up at once and move. He sends them out by stages. He takes them in pieces and says, okay, today this group of people will move. Tomorrow this group of people will move. God is a smart commander. He knows what he's doing. So just that's a little nugget for you there, okay? According to the commandment of the Lord, and they camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff, the rod of God, with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand there before you on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" All right, there's three things that I want you to see tonight. Three things. The patience of God, the rock of God, and the justice of God. Okay, let's have some fun. There's a couple of things I need you to see. The theme of this passage is this: the grumbling. The grumbling. The Israelites. If you could just pick one word to describe these people, this is it: the grumblers. This is all these people know how to do, is complain. It doesn't matter where they end up, this is what they're going to do, is complain. Did you ever know anybody like this? It doesn't matter where you take them. You could take them to the nicest restaurant in town and they'd find something wrong with it. You could just take them to, what's the nicest restaurant in this town? Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. You know, you got the white linen, you got the most expensive steak, and then, well, it's not hot enough. It's not cool enough. I mean, they're just going to complain. These people complain over everything. They're always complaining. Now, here's the issue. The word that gets translated quarrel is a really interesting word. In English, it's okay, but we need to add a little weight to it, okay? If I say to you, "Hey, I've got a quarrel with you," that's different than if I just say, "I've got a little problem with you." If I say, "I've got a quarrel with you," I'm bringing, in the original language, the words got a little more depth to it. It actually means to bring a charge. They're bringing a lawsuit against Moses. You know how we know this? Because Moses, when he goes to God, what does he say? "They're about to stone me." There are only a few capital offenses in the Hebrew code. Why are they about to stone him? Because they are accusing him of manslaughter before the fact. What they're saying is, you brought us out here, there's no water to drink. How quickly do you die of thirst? Pretty quickly. You don't have water, you're in deep trouble. You're in big trouble. And what they're saying is, listen, there's 3 million people here. We've got our women, we've got our children, and we've got our animals, and we're going to die. And this is your fault. And we're going to kill you before we die. That's really what they're saying. We're bringing a charge against you. That's what the problem is. This passage, these 7 verses are really interesting. You have to read them really carefully to get the whole weight of what's going on. And the weight of what's going on is this is a legal proceeding. This is not just a nice little story in the Bible. There is a legal proceeding going on here. And they have brought a charge against Moses and said, "We're holding you accountable." Now here's the real problem. They're really not holding Moses accountable. Who are they holding accountable? God. They're really saying, let's think about it. You've dragged us out here in the middle of the desert. You saved us. You rescued us. And you brought us where there's no water? You brought us out here to die? What is wrong with these people? We have the benefit, let me just tell you, we have the benefit of being able to read this whole passage all at once. So what do we see? We see over and over again what God does. What? He saves them. He rescues them. He comes through. Why am I telling you this? Because here's what's happening with some of you right now. You're thinking, God's let me down again. He's not going to come through for me. He's going to fail me. You're just like they are. I'm just like they are. We're all just like they are. You see, this passage actually is quite self-revealing about us. We're just like them. But when we read the passage, we get to see the overview rather than the on-the-ground picture. And the on-the-ground picture for all of us is we always forget what God has done. What we think is we read this passage and we think, you idiots, do you not remember what God just did for you? He sent Moses to save you. He did 10 magnificent plagues. He parted the Red Sea. He brought you out. Like if I was there, and I showed up and there was no water, I mean, isn't it obvious what you should do is say something like, well, there's no water here. We should probably just wait a few minutes. God will do something. Right? That's the logical thing to say. What do they say? Well, he's going to let us down. God? Who's he? I mean, are you kidding me? How could they be so dense? After everything that God has done, how could they possibly think he's brought them out there and is not going to provide them any water? Really? But that's exactly what they did. Oh, isn't that just like us? You see, we're compressing 10, 20 years of history into a future. You can read this whole book in a couple hours. We're compressing all that history into such a short time, we can read it and go, oh, they're so stupid. But what about your history? Can you not remember that God has come through for you over and over and over and over again? He's rescued you. He's saved you. He's brought you through. He's carried you. And now here you are at this moment and you think everything's going to fall apart, but isn't he able? He is. He will. He'll take care of you. Listen, quit worrying. What's the story here? It's not the Israelites. The story is the patience of God. Because honestly, if you're God, and these people stick their finger up at you and say, have you brought us down here to die? What should you do? If you're God, if I'm God, what would I do? You impudent little imbeciles. I'm just going to smash you. You're right, I am going to leave you to die. I'm not only going to leave you to die, I'm going to make you die and smash you. I'll start over. But what does God do over and over and over and over and over? He says, oh, you're thirsty and you're complaining? I'll give you some water. Let's start over again tomorrow. The patience of God is on beautiful display here. And in every, and next week we're going to talk about they run out of food. Or they get tired of the food, actually. I mean, these people, and God, what does he do? Well, he does get a little, okay, we'll get to that story next week. All right. So, Moses turns to God and he says, what am I to do with these people? And God says, give them water. The patience of God. The patience of God. So, the reason that we keep going over this, the reason that I keep bringing this up with you is this. I want you to trust him. I want you to believe him. I want you to know he loves you. I want you to know he cares about you. When tragedy strikes, when anything happens in your life, generally we do one of two things. We accuse God of wrongdoing, That's what we do. We say, God, you've really messed up this time, or we run to him for help. Which one are you? Which one are you? You see, we kind of end up in two places in our life. We accuse him of doing something wrong, or we run to him for help. Have you noticed that in the culture? Listen, our culture is very good at this. As soon as anything goes wrong, it's quite all right. Just let him come on up. As soon as anything goes wrong, some tragedy, an earthquake, a hurricane, people who hate God, what do they say? Well, if there is a God, he should have done something. If there really was a God, then we should blame him for this. He should have stopped it. But do you notice that they never go to the flip side? What about when things are good? What about when their pockets are full of money? What about when the stock market is going up? What about when their job is great? You don't ever hear those same people saying, well, if there is a God, we should thank him. My Taiwanese friends, let me just ask you a question. I know what Western culture is like. I'm not sure exactly what Eastern culture is like. I know that people run to the temple when there's a problem. Do they also run to the temple when things are great? I'm not sure they do. I don't know. You can talk to me about that afterwards. Listen, okay, so the second thing. All right, that's the first thing, the patience of God. You must remember that, the patience of God. We get an English, there's an old English word that we used to use, we really don't use it anymore. It's called long suffering. Long suffering. This is where that word actually really has meaning. Long suffering. Isn't God at this place? He's long suffering with these people. He's suffering long with them. That's what the idea is. The second thing, the rock of God. What about this thirst? God says, strike the rock and water will come out and the people will drink. Why does God, let's think about this. Where are they? They're in the desert. If you're in the desert, listen, I've watched a survival show or two. If you're in the desert, where do you go for water? You dig down, right? You dig into the sand and you find you look for some place that has maybe a little green sprig or whatever, and you dig in. What is God doing? He says, go strike the top of a rock. There's no water in the top of a rock. What's he doing? He's proving his ability to supply from the most unlikely places. He will do the same thing for you. He will do the same thing for you. When your need is the greatest, God's grace will flow from the most unlikely places. I think almost every Christian in this room will verify this. Here's what I want you to get out of this. In the desert, and here's what God is trying to teach us. In the desert, what is God doing with us? All our other sources of satisfaction dry up. Why does God lead us into the desert? Because we're drinking from other wells. Our job, our bank account, our spouse, our girlfriend or boyfriend, and all these other things become more satisfying to us than God. And so God takes us into the desert so all those things dry up. And then he reveals that he is the only source that will truly satisfy our thirst. He is the only place you can truly get satisfaction. Don't you know, out of those 2 or 3 million people that were wandering around the desert, they were digging lots of holes looking for water. Don't you know there were people out there going, I can find some water. Listen, I found a cactus. I'm digging this sucker out. I mean, don't you know they were digging, that desert was full of holes. And don't you know there was not one of them that produced water? And God was saying, no, you're not going to find it anywhere else. The only water in this desert will come from the most unlikely place. And dear friend, this is what God is going to do to you. You're going to try to find satisfaction in your job. You're going to try to find satisfaction in your marriage. You're going to try to find satisfaction in your children. You're going to try to find satisfaction in something, and God is slowly going to allow it to dry up and wither away until you come to Him. And then He will open the floodgates of His heavenly well, and you'll be full. You'll drink, and you'll never thirst again. That's what Jesus said. His water is all thirst quenching. It will quench your deepest thirst. Let me give you an example of how is it that out of some great problem in our life, we actually become better people? I'm going to give you a very simple example, and then you can take and probably figure out how it applies to you. A lot of us in this room are parents. And if you're not a parent, you've been a child. Okay? So it works for everybody. Imagine a little child, about 4 or 5 years old, really wants to go to their friend's birthday party. The birthday party is coming up. They've been invited. They've been preparing all week, and they are so ready to go to the birthday party. And on the night before the birthday party, they tell a big lie. I mean, they blow it at home. I mean, they tell the biggest lie to their mom and dad. And what can you do? You know, as the mom and dad, you have to punish them. So you say, you know, little Johnny, little Mary Jane, tomorrow, I'm sorry, you're not going to your friend's birthday party. And that little kid does what? They throw themselves on the floor. Wah, no, you can't stop me. I must go. You know, please don't. And you say, no, I'm sorry, you're not going. And you kind of have two options, right? You have the existential option. You could sit down and say, now listen, let me reason with you. Here's the issue. I must punish you in this way because if you go on lying like this down the road, you will become a liar and you will have relationships fall apart and your whole life will just disintegrate. So I must inflict this punishment on you now. What's that child going to do? The child's going to look at you like a 5-year-old. They're going to be like, what? I just want to go to the party. No, you can't do that. You just have to say, listen, I'm sorry, go to your room. You're not going to the party tomorrow. That's what a good parent will do. If you want to talk to me about parenting, we'll talk later. Because in that moment, the child must learn lying bad consequences. Later on, they'll figure out the bigger picture. You don't want them to become a liar. And you got to break that early. Sometimes, so if you as a parent can understand that related to your little child, doesn't it stand to reason that sometimes in your life there will be things happen that God allows, either consequences for your action or other things that come into your life that God, how much higher is He than you? And how much more does He love you than even a parent could love a child? He will allow things and bring things into your life to make you into a person of glorious character. Because isn't that what you want for your child? You don't want your child to be a liar. You want your child to be a truth teller. Because that kind of character shines so brightly. Doesn't God want the same for you? How can He develop that other than by bringing things into your life that at the time will seem very difficult and very hard? The wilderness can be a hard place, but so necessary. Okay, the last point, and we'll be done. The rod of God, the justice of God. What's going on? I told you this was a trial. How do we know that? Here's how we know. Number one, I told you because they're getting ready to stone Moses. Number two, we know it because there's another place where Moses is commanded to bring water from a rock. And he is not allowed to strike the rock. He's told to speak to the rock. But he makes a mistake and he does strike it. And it costs him his entrance into the promised land. It's in Numbers chapter 20. This is so serious. So what is happening here? God tells Moses, get the elders, the jury, get the staff, the rod of God, and walk before the people. Listen, nobody just walked around with the staff of God. Okay, that wasn't like a toy. You didn't just walk around, oh, I got the staff of God today. No. That staff was really special. Every Israelite knew what that staff could do. What did Moses use that staff for? To turn the Nile River to blood. To part the Red Sea. So when God said, hey Moses, get the staff and bring it out, and they had already accused him of a capital crime, so the trial is already in session. When Moses brings the staff and the jury and starts walking towards the people, what did the people think? We're on trial. God is going to judge us with the staff. I have a feeling that there were lots of people who just fainted right there. They probably thought, we're dead. God's going to kill us all. But something strange happens. Moses walks past the people. He doesn't stop. Now, what is Moses thinking? Because I have a feeling Moses, when God said, get the staff, I think Moses probably thought, oh, you're going to put me on trial? Yeah, we'll show you. We're going to put you on trial. But then God says, no, keep walking. We're going to the rock. Now something crazy happens. You need to read this really carefully. Go back, chapter 17, verse 5. And the Lord said to Moses, pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel. Take in your hand the staff which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you. The language here is really important. If a greater is standing in front of a lesser, how do you phrase that? If I were to see the president, how would I say that? I stood before the president. What is he saying? He's saying, God is saying, I stand before you. Who's judging who? Who's on trial? God is. God's on trial. What? I tell you, we always learn something when we read these passages, right? We learn something about ourselves, we learn something about God, and we learn something about Jesus. This is a picture. This is a picture. On the cross, who was struck for our iniquity? Jesus was struck with the rod of God's justice. Every complaint, every grumble, every piece of wickedness that these people did had to be paid for. Who would pay for it? God would. The striking of the stone was representative. It was to provide for the people what they needed: grace, water. But it was also to judge. And that day, God was judged. A picture of what was coming. That on the cross, his Son would ultimately be judged to make a way for them all to be saved. That's what it means for us to know Jesus Christ. How can you be saved? Because you're a complainer too. You're a grumbler too. You're faithless. You don't believe God like you should. So how can you have a relationship with him? Only through Christ. only through one who was judged in your place. And that's the picture. He was struck for you. He was struck for you. And tonight, if you're not a Christian, if you're not a believer in Christ yet, that's what you need. That's what you need more than anything. And if you are a Christian tonight, guess what? You're free. You have the water of God's grace to sustain you. So the question is, what are you holding on to, trying to suck the life out of it to keep you sustained? Your job, your marriage, your children, your money? It's not satisfying, is it? Let it dry up before God takes you all the way into the wilderness. Drink from the rock. The rock is Christ. All right? Let's pray. God, thank you for your word, which speaks such great truth. Help us to see and to know Christ, to love and adore him evermore, to drink from the living water so we'll never thirst again. Amen. All right. Thank you for being here tonight. Translator people, meet with Faye up here. Easter party fellowship people, meet with Georgie in the back. All right? And if we want to go eat somewhere together, we'll figure that out in a little bit. You're welcome to hang out and do it up.